Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio, Paes.
And today we are talking about humility, which I believe is a very important concept in inner work.
And I agree. I think it's, according to different spiritual traditions, it's the most important thing. And I would mention Christian tradition and other Eastern religions that plays a very, very central role in inner work.
Yes, yeah. And I think in some ways it's a really key part of what the whole Enneagram project is about, I believe, which is disidentifying from ego. Because humility gets defined from the ego or personality point of view. But we're going to be talking about how humility commonly gets understood, but also how we might understand it when we're using the Enneagram for inner work, and what an important concept it can be, and how it can really help us with what we need to do when we're discerning the difference between ego and not ego.
Right, yeah. And I think there are different dimensions of the talk about humility. I think that there is one dimension that is more like the importance of humility in psychological things, and another one in spiritual quest, connected, in my view, both with what we talk about in our model of levels of awareness and the very central importance of humility so that we get to certain points. So there are different takes on how humility is important, but reality is that all of them converge to say that it's a central thing. So hopefully we can talk about a little bit about all of these, and also say something about each type and each dominant instinct and humility.
Yeah, I think it's good, an important topic. So I'll start by saying a few things about what I think is important to understand about humility. One is, well, of course, many people who study the Enneagram may know that humility is the virtue of type 2, of my type. And again, the passion of the type is the emotional state of the heart that drives a lot of the personality, and in some ways keeps the person trapped at this lower level of consciousness that we find ourselves in when we're identified with personality. So pride is the passion of type 2, but pride is something that we all can have. And we'll also talk about how it's pride is something that social dominants have more than average or more than other types. And so we'll talk about it from those perspectives. And while humility is the virtue of type 2 that opposes the passion of pride, so the two's particular journey goes from being more conscious of how pride operates more and more of the time, to, as the person does inner work, getting more and more in touch with humility, as an antidote to pride, as an antidote to what twos can do too much of in personality. But it's also important to recognize that humility is important for everyone. And one of the ways I learned this is by studying Dante's Divine Comedy, which some of you know. I've sort of studied that in conjunction with the Enneagram, and finding the correspondences and the way both are highlighting a kind of esoteric, important spiritual wisdom or spiritual journey. Although in Dante's Inferno, of course, people know there are three books or three canticles in Dante's epic poem, the Divine Comedy, which is, although it was written over 700 years ago, is still relevant for us today and the lessons it has to teach. There are three canticles. One is Inferno or Hell, one is Purgatory, and the third is Paradise. And it's about these three states of consciousness that we're in. And in Inferno, of course, we find all the seven deadly sins plus fear and deceit in a certain kind of way. And so we can see that Dante is describing in Inferno what we're like when we are completely identified with personality and we haven't risen above it or disidentified from it in any way. He calls it a kind of slavery, really. We're a slave to our ego. And in hell, the people are depicted as kind of doing the same thing over and over again for eternity, which is what it's like when we trap ourselves at this lower level of awareness by not doing inner work and just kind of going with what the personality's priorities are forever. But purgatory is the place of purgation. But the difference, of course, is repentance. So when we can have the consciousness to see the error of our ways without feeling guilty or judging ourselves too much, then we can go to a higher level of awareness and start the purging process that leads to higher states of awareness. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Dante's comedy is that he puts the struggle of the types in there, right? Like people struggling with lust and people struggling with deceit and anger and avarice in hell. But he also has a hierarchy, right? Which with the Enneagram, we say all the types are the same, which they are in terms of challenges and functional qualities, and in terms of the capacity for inner growth. But in Dante's version, he has both all those struggles with our personality complexes, but he also has a hierarchy which has, like, for instance, in Inferno, lust is at the top, then gluttony, and then all the way down, deceit and pride are at the bottom. And of course, pride is the sin of Satan, which is the idea that, what was Satan's, the fallen angel's big sin? What was his big mistake, his big problem that caused him to fall? And again, and he signifies something about the fall from consciousness for all of us, and that is his big sin was pride, because he said I in the face of the only one. So he put himself at the same level as God. And that was, in Dante's scheme, the worst sin, right? So it's at the bottom, it's punished at the lowest level of hell. Now we know that he didn't mean twos are worse than everyone else because their main sin is pride. I think what he says is that this is a journey for all of us. All of us have to contend with some of these different issues, and that the hardest one is pride, because pride is in some ways that the element that keeps us identified with the ego, that keeps us attached to an ego self image, a way we want or need to see ourselves, or the way we want others to see us. That is a big part of the definition of getting stuck in personality. We're protecting our image, our idealized self image, from harm. But in doing that, we're protecting a lower level of awareness and keeping ourselves stuck at this lower level. And of course, in purgatory, humility is the first terrace that everybody needs to climb when they climb up the mountain of purgatory that has seven terraces that each are associated with a particular one of the passions and the virtues. And the first one is, people go there and they work off the sin of pride by doing hard tasks, like, which is a very good way of saying what we need to do today in our inner work. But it's also, I think he's saying something very important, that pride is in some ways the hardest sin to get over, because it's how we are seeing ourselves as our personality. And it's hard to see that we aren't our personality. And then humility is the hardest, but it's the thing we need as the foundation of all other inner work, because it's the way we see our blind spots, we see our mistakes, and we can own them and repent for them, which is a way of regretting them with feeling, but not making ourselves bad or guilty or shameful because of our mistakes, because that just keeps us in hell. Because when we feel excessively bad about our mistakes, or certain aspects of us, that keeps us at a lower level of awareness, because then our personality needs to come in, our ego needs to defend us. And so the cycle continues between feeling deflated and excessively bad about ourselves, and then needing to rescue ourselves by feeling excessively good about ourselves. So humility in Dante's sense, and I think in a larger universal sense, is this idea about seeing ourselves as we are and doing the hard work of being honest with ourselves about who we are, what our capacities are, what our limitations are. Now, I know we also want to give it to you in a moment because I've said a lot here, just sort of bringing in the Dante piece, which really informed in a powerful way for me how central humility is. But also, I think we want to name that humility gets defined by us when we talk about it, since we are, always much of the time talking from an ego standpoint. It gets defined in terms of the ego, right? Humility in terms of, sometimes we think of it as thinking less of yourself or being self-deprecating or needing to make yourself feel worse about yourself in some ways to compensate for feeling too good about yourself. And that is the personality definition. But really, I think what's important to recognize is there's a personality definition of humility, but also a spiritual definition of humility, which I think is what Dante's really talking about. So we want to just identify that there are both of those definitions, and we want to be clear about what the distinctions are. Now, one last thing I want to say, and then I want to hear from you, Uranio, and that is that there's a quote that I use in the Complete Enneagram at the beginning of the Type 2 chapter, and it's from C.S. Lewis, and I think it speaks to what we're talking about here. He says, C.S. Lewis says about humility, he said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking about yourself less. And so I think what he points to here is it's not this kind of self deprecation. It's like, oh, I have to feel bad about myself to somehow right the balance of sometimes thinking too good about myself, being in pride. But it's more knowing my place in the universe, knowing that as a human, I'm kind of insignificant in the big scheme of things. And which leads to a sense of perspective and a sense of, it's not that I'm not important or I don't have good qualities. It's that I need to see myself in the proper perspective and I need to be more real or realistic about who I am so that I can do my inner work from a place of truth.
Uh, yes, very nice, B. And so I think that um, in my experience with some particular kinds of inner work, humility um, brings some understanding of our self-development process that I didn't have previously before studying those lines of self-development. When you say this beautiful phrase of thinking of ourselves less, being humility, the way that I came to understand it with more depth is not only not thinking of us so much and thinking of others, and uh, not only saying less the word I, which is a very good exercise, but it's also something deeper, which is understanding that our self development process does not depend on ourselves as much as we think it does. And also understanding that in order for us to grow, it's not enough for us to make all possible efforts and to be totally committed to doing inner work, but also there are some difficult to understand forces giving us permission or not to raise up to higher levels of awareness. And this is very difficult to understand, especially in Western societies that sustain the myth of meritocracy, that if we do our parts, we'll get the benefit. And also, what is a very anthropocentric view of reality, as in the man, as in the human being, is in the center of everything with all possible free will. And that's not how these lines of work, that's not what they believe in and what they teach. Actually, it's a problem to think that we can make everything happen, even in our own self development process. It's also a problem to think that we can control our process of development, and another problem of thinking that I do whatever I want to do, and I can take things on one way or another, as if everything would obey our own individual will. And by the way, also related to point two of on the Enneagram, not only type two, but point two, the point two in all of us, really. There is an understanding that's, I think, is useful, which is there is this beautiful holy idea called holy will, which is a will much bigger than mine. And then working on that part of our personalities, we need to understand that our small personal will is nothing when it comes to that. Sometimes we say things like, if you want to make God laugh, just tell him your plans, right? But it's more like if I have my own will, and even in here, we're also talking about willpower, right? So the commitment to do hard work. If we think that that is enough, then we'll have a problem with humility, because there are the scheme of things, and even those permissions, and how growth works goes way beyond this linear reasoning that if I do this I will get that. It's not linear, and it's not linear in many different ways. It's hard. I won't talk much about this now, but Gurdjieff used to explain that the ruler is not the same for everybody. Also, that people have different capacities. And sometimes we see in practice people that make so much effort sometimes have side effects in their inner work, because it's almost like I do so much effort, and then our lower minds, our egos say, therefore, I have the right, or I deserve, or that should be happening with me, and then I feel bad about myself if it isn't happening. So this all speaks about humility. So in inner work, when we are getting to a certain level of awareness, and for the ones already familiar with the CP model of levels, we had podcasts about this. It would be the end of level 2, and more particularly level 4. For the ones getting in touch with that, there is one fundamental thing to understand and do, which is feel completely depleted and out of your own strength. Like feel that your own strength has been taken away from you. It's the first dark night, the first called the dark night of the senses, in which we feel we can't go ahead with our own forces, because our own strength, because it's simply not there. And that has to do with humility. Humility is a total understanding that I don't have the solutions, that I have lost this war. I don't know what to do next, and it ceases to be my next step ceases to be about my own efforts. It's more about surrendering, and surrendering not in okay, now I will be open to that. It's not only that, it's a surrendering of someone that has been individually defeated, as in, now life brought me a situation that I'm on my knees, and I don't have the energy or the wisdom or any capacity of any kind to keep going myself ahead, and as a consequence, I look down and I say, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not good enough. I don't have the solution myself. And then we can finally get to a level of relaxation that is unique, because it's the relaxation of one who really stops being in the active energy and gets more into the receptive energy. Like, I give up. I can't, I don't know the solution. And I'm lost. And I don't know what to do next. And I've tried so many things and they don't work. So it's more about also the teaching of Jesus Christ, that for me and for many was, the history figure that taught the most about humility in so many ways. But it's not only in Christian tradition that we see this. It's also like in Islam, and more particularly Sufism, in which you have to practice this, um, stripping off yourself of any personal identity, and even the fact that you have to pray bowing, once every few hours, like 5 hours a day in their prayers. It has to do with bringing humility back, because it only takes a few minutes or hours for all of us human beings of any type to get caught again by pride. So we need to come back to looking down. And then at certain points, there are sayings and recitations that go like, I'm no one, I'm no one, or what they say, La ilaha illallah, which is, there is no God but God. That has multiple meanings, and one need to recite to get all those meanings. But one of them is, I'm not God, right? So I don't know, I'm not that important. And Gurdjieff used to say that in a certain advanced point of development, the student needed to say to themselves, I am an idiot. I am a complete idiot, especially when we're getting in touch with spiritual power, so that the spiritual pride doesn't get hold of us.
Yeah, so definitely I like the way you are helping us understand the more spiritual meaning of humility, not the personality meaning of humility, which is, and again, I think can't be pointed out enough, because I think sometimes when people are on the path, they can think something like, well, I need to think less of myself in a way of almost self-criticism, or getting, judgmental of myself if I'm too self elevated. But really, this is about catching ourselves in the act when we are in pride, or when we are seeing ourselves as more important than we are, and simply recognizing that truth and being able to open up to a kind of humility that sees ourselves as not the center of the universe, sees ourselves as when we're in personality, we can play God, but we are at a much lower level of awareness, and all the experience of the spiritual path that we need to understand conceptually, like you're saying. And I did want to highlight one thing that you said, and that is, in the Christian tradition, the way Jesus really, I think, embodies and teaches so much about humility, even the symbolism of being born in a manger, right, is, I think, a lesson in humility. And so, what we're really talking about here is a larger or more spiritual sense of humility, which is, depending on what Enneagram type you are, what dominant instinct you have, can you really work at seeing yourself more truly as you are, where you are, without the kind of self-criticism that actually keeps us stuck at a lower level of awareness, because then our ego needs to balance that out by at some point compensating and making you feel good about yourself in a self-elevating way, such that you are making yourself better than you really are, or more important than you really are. But also to not kind of go on that inflation deflation back and forth, but go to a higher level of humility, which really means, and I think this is the first terrace of purgatory, it really means I can really reckon with and see the ways I have been in pride, the ways I have seen myself in ways that distort who I really am for egoic reasons of needing to have a role in the world or play a certain part or get what I need from a almost animal or survival point of view. Can I see that and recognize it for what it is and disidentify from it and identify with a higher perspective, with this sense that actually I am who I am, from the perspective, a cosmic perspective of the universe. I'm rather small and insignificant, but I am who I am and I do have a role to play. And I need to also own my capacities, but also my limitations. And if I can do that in the way that you're saying, in the way that all, I think, of the world's core religious traditions teach us, I can learn to take my proper place. I can bow down to something higher. And in doing that, and in reminding myself of my place in the universe, of my capacities and limitations, I I do the spiritual work of seeing, owning, and being who I am, embracing what is instead
Right.
of living in more of an illusion of what I'd like to be, or what I was told I needed to be to get the care that I needed when I was young. And so I think this happens in, of course, 9 and 27 different ways, which we'll explore in a moment. But anything you would add to that kind of, what we both said? And I think my last minute's trying an attempt to kind of both synthesize and build
Yeah.
on, this super important concept of humility.
Yeah, thank you for all that. Yes, what I want to add is the acceptance. Two sets of things actually. The first is the acceptance of what life brings us and what our life has been, out of an understanding that we have no clue why that happened from a spiritual perspective, and that there are forces that are in charge that we are not. And so accepting not only ourselves, because we talk a lot in the West about self acceptance, which is very important, but there is another kind of acceptance, which is acceptance of my history, of my stories, acceptance of the parents that I had at the same time that I do all the psychological work of bringing up the actual feelings I had, or acceptance of how my life ended up being, or when I started to do inner work. We hear so many people saying, "Oh, if only I had started working with the Enneagram in an earlier stage, right, of my life." So all humility is acceptance for all there is, not only myself, but also acceptance of others. And the second set of things, and then I'll stop, um, is I believe that we can also see humility from another angle, which is the angle of human values, both um, discussed in spirituality and discussed in simply some rules of living life. I think both are valid, actually. What it is to live a more virtuous life, right? And I think that bottom line, we will come to concepts that are known by all of us, but we insist in forgetting. things like respect the other, respect your neighbor, and listen to people instead of just talking yourself. And make sure that you pay attention, holding inside an actual position of not being the owner of the truth, not believing that you know it all or that you know more, and be gentle and don't judge other people. So those kinds of values lead to humility, and sometimes these values inform better ways of living our daily life that will bring us closer to humility if we really practice them.
Right. And I want to highlight one thing that you said about humility that I think is really key, and that is when we're in our everyday lives operating from personality, I think we sometimes have the illusion that we can exert control over everything or whatever we want to exert control over. And I think that's one of the things that I think you're highlighting of like, we're not in control. And sometimes the more we think we are, the more life kind of slaps us in the face to wake us up.
Yeah.
And that, like, sometimes I notice, like, when something doesn't turn out the way I wanted, or there's a disappointment, sometimes what I try to do is I try to look at that and say, okay, why, if I look at this from the point of view of greater forces than me or that I understand have brought this about, what if this was meant to happen? What if this is meant to happen to teach me something, or that so I can learn through a challenge of not having gotten what I wanted, or things not have gone going the way I wanted them to. What if I looked at it from that perspective of I'm not in charge, and the more I think I can control the way things go in my life, the more the rug will be pulled out from under me as I go, because we need to, if we can open up to what something larger than ourselves is doing to guide us and have that humility, often we flow more with life. We flow more with what's happening. We don't resist. I notice sometimes when I'm like trying to make something happen the way I think it should, and the problems keep cropping up. And sometimes it's just like something technological isn't working for me today and doesn't work for me tomorrow. But then the third day it works all of a sudden. It's like, well,
Yeah.
maybe I was being slowed down for some reason. I think if we
Yeah.
can take that cosmic perspective when we're doing inner work on our personality, it really helps us because it gets our personality out of the place of getting frustrated and resistant and self-critical, because we're opening up and realizing, okay, although my personality leads me to play God, I'm really not at the level of God. I'm not even God's assistant.
Yeah.
I am here as a human on earth at this relatively low plane of awareness and need to operate accordingly. And the more I can do that, the more things will flow in ways that work for me, and sometimes in very surprising ways.
Yeah. B, if you don't mind, I'll add yet one more concept.
Please, yes. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it took me a lot of time to realize something that I still find curious, and that is relaxation is connected to humility, and presence also is connected to
Yes.
humility. So, how?
Yes.
How so? It's more like when we are not relaxed, we are exerting our own strength. We are trying to live life out of our own power. And it's conventional to say so many times to people, you need to own your own power. Well, maybe people need to own true transcendental power instead. So
Mhm.
relaxation is the capacity to stop being in charge and being in touch with your own power, and instead you just let it go. And sometimes it also has to do with finally releasing the need to be right, and then you relax. And relaxation is actually this: it's surrendering to law of gravity. It's like, oh, now my body can be held by the earth or Mother Earth, and I can totally feel gravity. And then, if I have developed my three senses, which in itself requires humility of saying my dominant center is not all there is. If I develop all three and I learn to be at the same time in all three, and then I relax, I will feel some indications of presence, like my feet feel like going under the ground, my body is heavy, and that is, oh, I surrender and I don't need to have a power of myself.
Yeah, really, really good point. And I want to say that similar to what you're saying, hopefully, as you listen to this, you're recognizing that when we really have humility as a goal or as something that we're working toward, it's actually a relief to know that we're not in charge. It's actually can be a relief because
Very
our ego like strives and struggles and pushes and resists in ways that create so much more challenge and problem and difficulty in our lives. And when we can sort of just name what's happening and relax and kind of give up the fight that we can't win anyway because we aren't, we are just who we are. Then there's actually, things get easier, not harder, when we give that up, I think. And then when we see ourselves in our right size,
yeah, yeah,
which again, I really want to emphasize, it doesn't mean thinking badly about yourself or thinking less about yourself or being excessively self deprecating. It's more about thinking about yourself as you are.
right.
So when you're observing yourself, just noticing what's really true instead of what you want to be true. Right. And I've noticed that a lot when I'm working with pride. And I notice both two things I just want to highlight. And again, type two's main thing is pride. So it's really big for me. But but all the types are prototypes for something all the types have. Right. And I think this is twos are the prototype of working on the pride of ego in a way that all the types need to. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We keep promising and we'll get there. But sometimes when I catch myself in pride, there's a kind of ouch, there's a kind of pain. It's like embarrassment or humiliation or disappointment in myself. And I think the key is to not to recognize how we can feel bad about ourselves sometimes and just to allow ourselves to feel that sense of badness but not take it too much to heart. Sort of see it as a fleeting emotion. If we can name it and see it and feel it, then we don't react against it, right? So if I feel kind of deflated, it doesn't mean the answer is to inflate myself,
Mm,
right? Because I don't want to feel the pain of that deflation. If I can feel like, oh, I caught myself in the act of being trying to be bigger than I am or more important than I am, and oh, now I feel like really humiliated or embarrassed. Well, what if I can just allow myself to feel the ouch of that and then move on from it, not kind of go down into the gutter with it,
yeah,
just be like, oh, well, there I go again. I'm human. I did it again. And so we can sort of get out of this cycle of inflation, deflation of, oh, I feel bad about myself. So somehow I need to make myself feel better. Or I get stuck in feeling bad. And then that's where I'm stuck. I think we can be stuck in being too prideful. We can be stuck in being too self deprecating, too self critical, or we can get stuck in the cycling back and forth. And so maybe that's something to think about when we think about the nine types as well.
yeah. If we're moving to more to the Enneagram dimension and we talk about the nine types, maybe I suggest we talk first about a more general Enneagram thing around humility. And I'll start. Maybe you will like to add. So the Enneagram explains so much that it ends up being a tool for a person to be less humble at times. So, in what ways? I see people saying things like, "Oh, now I know." And no, you don't know yet because it's all a mystery. And a
Mhm.
second thing is I learned the Enneagram and my life completely changed. No, your life has not changed. You had an aha moment and you were impacted by that, but it hasn't changed yet. Changing requires so much more work. Oh, now that I've done all this work, it's better if you focus on what you haven't done yet, actually. And without feeling bad at yourself, because that will also be lack of humility. Then things like, oh, the problem I have in my life is that my partner or my friend doesn't do inner work. So here we are again, lack of humility and thinking that you're better. And by the way, we many times see that it's a little bit the opposite of what people are thinking. You know, when the partner comes to the workshop, we see that the partner is actually pretty good and prone to developing. Not always, of course, but
Sometimes.
yeah, sometimes it's more like we end up being caught in pride around the enneagram also, and one of the main ways is, oh, that person is that type, the person is mistyped and they don't know it and I need to tell them. So
Right.
it's very dangerous because it's a powerful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really good entry point of like recognizing we need to be humble when we're doing Enneagram work and when we're thinking about how much we know and all of that. So that's really important. So yeah, let's do move on. And I think we can continue to add concepts about humility as we go. Maybe let's start with the nine types and then say a bit about the instincts when they're dominant. So starting with type eight, and we'll do something short, I think, about each of the types. We won't go into a lot of depth because we've said a lot already about humility as a concept and as a practice. I would say with eights, they can have a kind of lack of humility when they, in personality, equate their view of things to the objective view. So I've run into eights who say, this is how it is. And they have a lot of confidence about the way it is. And they don't ever consider that they might be wrong, right? That the way they think it is isn't the way it is. And so I think that's something that eights need to watch out for, and bring in some humility around because. The eight ego can think, well, I need to know what's best so I can move things forward and meet these challenges. And they can also have some pride about their own strength. And when eights do inner work, it's beautiful because that where they go to a place of real sensitivity and softness and receptivity, and because they let go of that prideful sense of I see everything the way it is, I control the way things are, and that's the best for everyone.
Right. Yeah, I could add those thoughts that eights have, either verbalized or not. Like, I'm saying all of this to you for your own sake. You know, that's lack of humility to me. Or when the eight says, I know how this should be done. Or when the eight stops paying attention to the person with a very short attention span. So these are a few other signs of lack of humility for eights.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I think when eights bring in humility, it's a beautiful balancing out of that sense of being larger than life or being able to carry everything on their shoulders. It's a
Yeah.
relief, actually,
Yes.
if they can make that move, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, so type nines are interesting when it comes to this topic because their personality is in some ways defined by a kind of ego humility. Let's not call it humility
Yeah.
because it's like making themselves less in a certain way, seeing themselves as less important, which of course is the fixation of indolence. But also putting attention on other people and not themselves, as if their energy and attention is better spent, taken up by the outside world rather than on their own goals and agenda and being in the world. And so I think nines have the issue of, in some ways, too much of the self-deprecating side of the inflation deflation cycle that pride can be all about. And so recognizing that nines, they need to own who they really are, right? And own if they're angry. and own if they're powerful, and see those capacities and bring them to the world rather than kind of taking refuge in a making themselves less important kind of mindset that isn't real. It's not spiritual humility. It's a kind of ego modesty that doesn't serve them or others. So they need to right size their sense of themselves, a realistic appraisal of themselves by owning more of who they really are and what they bring to the world, and then bringing that more actively to the world around them.
Right. Yeah, that's really important to understand that modesty for nines is not a good thing as they think it is or others think it is, but it's also not humility. It's something that serves even principles of lack of humility. Like, I believe it's important for people to say less, to show off less, and so on, and that is being in control of the process, and a few more
Mhm.
things that actually have to do with lack of humility. But also, nines have things like, while the other person is saying something that they don't agree with, they smile and they make the other person believe that they are agreeing, while deep inside they say, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, and I'm not going to do that. So there is lack of humility in that. So there are more invisible ways of how nines lose touch with humility.
Right. Right. And so, of course, they humility for a nine is okay, who am I really? And reckoning more with their power. And sometimes that might mean making boundaries or getting angry, but that's part of the process of saying this is what's really true,
Mm.
and bringing that out.
Yeah, and the humility of saying, "Look, I'm not just this nice person that you believe I am. I'm full of anger, and I not don't always pay attention to you really as you think I'm paying attention to. I'm just hypnotized and more." So,
Mhm. Exactly. Great. Okay, so type one. Um, I think type ones can get into pride and lose touch with humility when they think they know the right way, when they assume they kind of operate on an assumption that my standards, my high standards, are the best or only standards that everyone should be held to, even themselves. I think they hold themselves to too high standards inside themselves and then see themselves as failing, criticize themselves. And so the inflation deflation for ones can be exhausting and difficult because they hold themselves to too high a standard, and again, see that standard as like being equal to this larger truth, but really it's just an invention of the ego. And so hopefully with some relief, I think ones when they're doing inner work, can step back and see with more perspective that their own sense of right and wrong, good and bad, what should be judged, that's all coming from ego, and it's coming from a mode that's about playing God. And when they can see it that way, I think sometimes that will help ones, because ones want to be good, right? They don't want to play God. They don't want to think they're in control of everything if they're not. But it's just, again, the default mode of the type one ego to just apply these standards and apply this is right, this is wrong, and live by that in too rigid a way. And so I think humility can help ones actually quite a lot when they bring it into their process in a conscious way, to question, like, well, who says these are the standards? Who says that's right or wrong? From a larger spiritual cosmic perspective, I don't decide that, and if I do, then I'm playing God, and humility is about really seeing how we're really not God.
yeah, yeah.
There
Yeah,
is no God but God, as the Sufis say.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, good points. And you know what? I think that type one is one of the types a bit more prone to arrogance, like fives
Mhm.
too. And I think
Yeah.
that is a sign of lack of humility. In
Yeah.
I know what's right, you don't, and you need to listen to me, and with the possibility of doing some preaching, and and in a way, making less of the other person who knows less, who does worse, or patronizing at times. And um, uh, and, and I think ones also lose touch with humility when they trust rules too much. Like, they end up knowing that that's the thing to do, and sometimes they are moral rules that they interpret a certain way. And then I want to say something that is not only for ones, it's for all body types, eights, nines, and ones. I think one particular lack of humility for body types is the belief that their instincts are so good that they always know who's lying, who's not, who's to be trusted, who isn't, or they know the way forward, so that there can be some pride in there, and it's not so good in my view to believe that.
Mm. It's interesting. I'm developing a theory as we talk. I wonder if there are like three types that are more stuck, get more stuck in the inflation, three types that get more stuck in the deflation, and three types that get more stuck in the inflation deflation cycle.
Interesting.
Because as we go to talking about twos, I'm thinking, I think as a two myself, I think we're one of the types that get stuck more in the cycling back and forth between inflation and deflation.
Mhm.
And I think this is why some twos, when they first learn about the passion of pride that we twos really need to study very, very closely, they don't get it. And it's so interesting because two is a case where I think our pride can be disguised by false pride often, right? It's that sense of inside myself, like I think I know better for you, or I can meet everybody's needs, but I don't have needs. But when I activate that on when I take action in the world based on that mindset, that egoic mindset of I know best, or I don't have needs, I'm here to serve others needs, there can be this kind of overlay or mask of, oh, I'm just doing things altruistically, I only care about helping you, I only want to make your life better. This sort of overlay that makes the two think that they're doing the prideful thing, like I know best, I'm meeting all the needs, which is pride. They're doing that for a higher reason, which they aren't, of course. And so I think the tricky thing is, because we don't see the pride very often, because it is our passion, and we may believe to some extent when we're identified with personality that we're just trying to be good, do good things, and we don't see the self-interest in it. I think when that gets pointed out, or when we get caught in the act, or when we catch ourselves in the act of being invasive with someone, or thinking we know things that we don't really know, or thinking we know what's best for someone else when it's really none of our business. When that happens, it's like the balloon gets popped, the inflation gets popped, and we feel horrible about ourselves. It can be so embarrassing to get caught in the act of, oh, I thought I was doing this nice thing for you, but really you didn't want it at all. And in fact, I pissed you off. And I see it was all about me. That is such an ouch, a big ouch for twos. And twos, I think, unconsciously get stuck in that need for inflation because it's in some ways a compensation for not getting the love we needed in childhood and not getting our needs met. It's like, well, I have to be better than everybody else so that I can get my needs met somehow. But we don't recognize the effect of that on ourselves and others, and we can sometimes go back and forth between the unconscious inflation and then what tends to be a more conscious deflation, because it's like a slap in the face, right? It's an ouch of, oh, now I feel horrible about myself because I wanted to be all things to all people, but I couldn't even be what I wanted to be to this one person, they're upset with me for trying to help them, when I was really just thought I was doing something good, when I really was now I'm exposed for doing something that was really all about me. Right. And that's very tricky for twos. So when I'm saying this, I want to say I have a lot of compassion for myself and for my fellow twos, because this is not an easy thing, and I think this is one of the reasons why that might have motivated us to talk about this, about humility generally for everyone today, because it's not just for us, it's for everyone. And it's a bit tricky for us because I think it is our passion. And we have to remember, for all nine types, the passion is a particular blind spot, right? And that's what the inner work is all about, is about working on the particular blind spot of your type, plus the larger, universal blind spots that we all have, which I think for everyone, we can all fall into playing God and lack humility. But for twos, I think it can be really tough to get our head around in the beginning of the path. And we need to really recognize that actually it can be a big relief to bring in humility and understand that it's not about needing to be better than we are. And it's not about needing to beat ourselves up as being worse than we are when we catch ourselves in the act of trying to be better than who we are, or thinking we're better than who we are, more important. It's more about seeing that and observing that dynamic in ourselves, naming it, feeling the ouch of it without letting it take us down into the deflation, which then we're going to need to compensate for by inflating, right? So getting out of that cycle and just being in the middle. I remember when I realized what humility really is, it was so amazing to me. It's like, oh, it's not needing to be more than or less than I am, right? Because as a self preservation too, I play small a lot of the time out of a fear of pride, right? But sometimes that can be pride too, because it's the deflation part. So, what I need to do is really notice what's happening and step away from it, step to a higher perspective, have compassion for myself about the fact that that's happening, but then try to stop the cycling by just relaxing and being who I am, just meditating on who I am, being in touch with my actual real limitations and my actual real capacities.
Well, thank you for your sharing. Super yeah, clear. What I can add is that, of course, there is the basic type 2 lack of humility of I know what your needs are and I don't have needs, and I know better than you what your needs are, and here's what you need to do. And I also think like I understand what's going on with you more than you do. Or I interpret situations of what's happening, and and sort of assuming that I know, right? Instead of saying this is one take or one opinion. And then thinking of leaders, type 2 leaders and professionals that I worked with in the past, things like finding it so hard to take in feedback. I think that eights choose, and for another reason, ones are perhaps the hardest to take in feedback, because they need to sustain that positive image, and it's hard to own things, or to own first before the other one owns. And also something about I see something that I saw when I was a coach of type 2 people, that they tried to have me as someone who would just support them, just back them up, and be on their side, as if coaching is having an ally, right? And I think it's difficult for choose to understand that coaching therapy is not about that. It's about really putting oneself in the position of being poked, being challenged, and then it's sometimes choose end up in practice without knowing, not being inviting of feedback from others, because they much more prefer to relate with others when they agree with them in whatever's happening and being allies, right? So tricky things for choose to see at times. I haven't always been successful with those clients of mine in helping them move through this.
Mm. Okay, so let's talk about threes. Um, Type three, I think that they can confuse the image that they need to have, that's maybe a very successful or powerful, competent image, with, a higher self, or with the way that they should be, the true self. um, it's like they are so confident because they get so good at getting results, at meeting goals, at completing tasks, at being successful, that they confuse worldly success with a kind of higher competence, or a kind of being right about how they should be.
Right.
Right. And so, which just makes it harder for them to disidentify from their persona, because that's the right way to be. That's the
Yeah.
way to be successful in the world. And that's the success is the main measure. Right. But that's pride, the pride of the ego that's good at getting worldly success, and the way it's defined by the world around them. And they get stuck in that in a certain way. And so, not having this higher perspective of, wait a minute, that's just one company or one social context or one example of what one could do. And yes, it accords with the what's defined as successful, but maybe it's wrong for other reasons. Like maybe it's not really what you want to be doing, or you cut some corners along the way that cause problems. And sometimes it can be hard for threes to see that. As long as the result matches the image of success, then it's somehow good in this bigger sense, or the way it should be. Whereas that's really only an illusion of the ego.
Mm, yeah, good points. I think um, threes get caught in pride and lack of humility also when they think they can be the best, and they aim for that. And when they think they can be more central to make things happen, and if they are not there, they don't happen. Also, thinking that they can manage their image all the time and that everything depends on them and they make things happen. But also, I sense a big lack of humility when some kinds of threes, not all, brag about themselves and their achievements. I also, I'm remembering now many passages of the past when I worked more in business with the Enneagram, and I've seen sometimes threes when something failed, that they would point fingers to other people on the team or other things, and not exactly to what happened with them. So it's a
Mhm.
little bit like lack of humility also to not own failure and to not stay with that and process that as it is and just a failure. Yeah, and I could say more, but I guess I'm starting to talk too much as we go. So I
As we
think
go, as we tend to do.
yeah.
um we both tend to do. So I think one last thing I would add for threes, of like what humility gives them, just like it gives, I think, freedom to twos and also brings them home to themselves. I think it brings threes more in touch with the true self.
Mhm.
If we're really talking about reality and who the person really is and how they really feel and what they really want to do and not want to do, I think, again, it can be a huge relief to be able to get in touch with that, although hard at first, because we should say that often coming out of pride into humility for all the types is a bit of a crash landing and not always a smoothie, the easy process. But if we are oriented to welcoming humility, then I think it helps us in big ways.
Mhm.
So type fours. Um, I would say about type four, sometimes the pride, the lacking humility means privileging an interpretation I make of what's true or of what I experience based on my inner emotional terrain. right? I bring things in and I define myself, I define relationships, I define what's happening based on my worldview, and again, that's something we're kind of saying all the types do that, but with fours, it's colored heavily by my internal emotional sense. And the tricky thing is, fours are emotionally intelligent. I think sometimes fours do correctly intuit what's happening at an emotional level. Sometimes the elephant in the room, they see that and feel it in ways others don't see, but then they give themselves too much credit for seeing the truth in everything. And so if they evaluate themselves as being deficient somehow, that's the truth of it. It's like they give that too much truth credit for being the truth. Like, there is just something wrong with me. That's a fact. And I believe that like a religious conviction, when really that's not true. That's actually false.
Mhm.
And so fours can believe in their own sense of inner emotional truth with too much pride and not recognize that while they have particularly good capacities for sensing the emotional truth, they go just as wrong as everybody else does in the final analysis if they're coming too much from ego, because the interpretation of what's happening is distorted by their having too much confidence in their own reading of things and their own interpretations that are overly based in their own emotional, the way they color things emotionally, their own emotional perspective from inside. It just, again, we sometimes say fours are too much inside themselves, not enough outside.
Yeah, and a little bit related to that thing about emotions that you talked about. I remember hearing from a four once. I pity people who can't feel deeply, and I think that's a lack of humility, as if that's the way of living life. And I'm superior, because I can feel this much and I can name my emotions and I am more emotionally mature. So I think there's a risk there for force to lose humility when that happens. And I think that self absorption and self referencing have a content of lack of humility inherent to them. As in, I don't pay attention to others, and what I'm feeling is more important than what the other person's feeling. Or I'm relating to people, but I see more my side of it and myself and not the other. I sometimes forget there is another one. And many times force also pass an image of not feeling good with other people and not caring much, and that oscillation is something that, oh, I'm really happy I'm with you, and in other times I really don't care you're here. So I think there is lack of humility that happens in all these ways and more.
Yeah, yeah, well said. So fives, maybe you want to start this one.
Oh my, how many hours do I have? So,
I know I said a lot about two also.
yeah, I think arrogance is so big for fives, maybe even more for a social five like me. Arrogance of truly thinking that we know because we have either studied more or reflected more, or we observe and analyze more. And I think for all head types there is a lack of humility of thinking that the head is more important than the heart or the body, because that gets reinforced by society. I mean, forever it looks like. And um, and also for fives there is this thing of, I'm not going to say because they won't understand, so why bother, and I won't even try. So there is an inner judgment of people being less capable many times that fives don't tell you about. And another thing is the lack of humility for a five when um, you know, finding it hard to just say how weird they feel in their inferiority. complex. Like I feel weird because I feel I'm not as capable as other human beings to do some basic things. And I feel less because of this and that. But the thing is, fives don't always say that. It would be really good for them if they said that. It would be humble, I think. And finally, I could speak for hours, as I said. One last thing, though, is fives don't speak because they think they are self sufficient and they don't ask for help and they don't bring in themes to a friend, to a therapist, to a coach, a teacher, because they think that they can solve everything themselves. Like so many fives that don't come to Enneagram courses because they think they can get everything they need through books. And, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Really well said. And I think I'll build on that only by saying that I think you're right that it's like when it comes to inner work or doing life, it's like the one personality can kind of get in a routine where they've got control over things. They've got control over, relationships or the work they do or how they do it to the point where they get comfortable and then they can think that's just the way it should be. Like there's no they can get arrogant even in kind of a spiritual way, like I have nothing to learn by being humble. I see the way things that they are, that I want to see them, that works for me, and I don't have to open up to new ideas. And again, they don't always see how that's coming from a deeper sense of not wanting to lose control of their energy, of their time. And so not wanting to open up to, oh, other people may see things or know things that I don't see or know, and I can and that can be an important thing for me to open up to. It's like that opening up to connection, nourishment, support from the outside world feels threatening, and so there's a rationalization of like, oh, I don't need that and everything's fine the way it is. And I do think it's important that we name, I like the way you said that we almost universally see fewer fives at our retreats. And I think in different countries, although maybe a little better in Brazil,
Mm.
we don't, we get zero fives or one five most of the time at, we were just in China, similar thing. And we sometimes say, well, what's going on that the fives don't come? And I think that this pride may be part of it.
Yeah. And just one point that comes to my mind be I think that the world of academia is five-ish, and I think it comes from that collective unconscious point five. And there is one side of it that has humility based in good science. Like I don't know what that is. I need to test. I need to have evidence. That's good.
I need to look
But
at the data. Yeah.
yeah, that's okay. But then whenever I see the environment in the academy of in all kinds, I think it's one of the worst places when it comes to humility. Those professors who really see themselves as being above, and then one competing with the other, and then having those talks that supposedly are so sophisticated, but it's actually just for showing what they know, and they don't know how much they don't know if they think they know, right? So just want to say that that environment to me speaks to the lack of humility of point five.
Right, right. And when fives can let in humility, of course, it can be scary because it means loosening your sense of control.
Yeah,
I think it can be so great for them because they can get nourished and supported in ways they didn't imagine,
yeah, yeah.
or ways they didn't want to see were possible, because it's
Right,
safer not to need people in the outside world, but they can get much more resources than they thought themselves capable of receiving.
right. Yes.
So type six, type sixes, I think, they're probably a type that's more on the deflation side, and that they tend to have a more self-deprecating view of themselves, maybe similar to nines. But I think there's a kind of pride in their own analysis of things, their own view that if I can think about a problem and all the different ways something could go wrong, then that won't happen, right? It's almost like they have a pride around how they can control what happens by thinking about it in their mind, or the way they think about it in their mind. If I can think about all the things that could go wrong, then I'll control what happens, right?
Yeah.
Or if I can solve the problem ahead of time, then that problem won't happen, or that unforeseen things won't crop up. But we're only human, and so we can't think of all the possibilities. But I think sixes can have too much pride in their ability to manage fearful scenarios by thinking of them ahead of time, by preparing, by taking action in different ways. But I think that's based on a kind of pride of being able to figure everything out, or control the world with your head.
Yeah, yeah, good points. The thing of saying, I know how to solve all problems more than other people, or I see all the problems and I see what others don't. Uh, Although some of these things may be, correct, and most of the time, not always, the thing is the pride that they feel in that, and that they need to take care of everybody because they know better how to do that. And then there is this thing that I've seen so many sixes. They feel proud for the fact that they know how to assess diseases other people have better than doctors, or they know
Yes.
what are legal things better than lawyers, so it's a little bit arrogant and exaggerated, and even if it's right, it's fueled by pride. But then I also want to say all sixes, even more so the social six, but I think all sixes, they get to a kind of certainty in their heads, or that that person did that because of that, with that intention, with moved by that.
Right.
And
Good
then
point.
that is a lot of lack of humility too.
Yeah, I think projection can be something where pride comes in, where I see this danger, or I see this person's bad intention, and I'm right about that. A little bit like I said with fours, and they
Right,
intuit something, and they can overdo being right about it.
right,
In a way, they can get really certain, and when they're wrong. So I think that's important, and I think humility can also help with the relaxation that sixes need to do. And I like how earlier in this conversation you connected humility with relaxation.
mm,
Relaxing all the tendency that sixes have to be motivated by fear, try to control everything, and try and believe that they can control by the ego's activity, which only exhausts them, and
yeah.
doesn't really have the power that they think it does.
Nice, yes.
Okay, so let's talk about type 7 last but not least.
Yeah,
I think sevens have pride around the way they have too much confidence and pride in the way they see the world and what's happening. And of course, they don't see that their perspective is motivated by fear sometimes, or pain, avoiding pain, but having like an excessively positive outlook, seeing something that's going to work out when really it's what we call in psychology magical thinking. Like if I think this can happen, then it will, and sort of taking that playing God perspective of, if I can plan this out in my head, then and as the best thing that can happen, then that's the best thing that can happen.
yeah,
So thinking they can avoid life's pains is prideful. Thinking that they should control what happens in their experience, in a way where they can avoid the negative and only experience pleasure, is prideful. And also, I think sometimes they think that that's the way everyone should live, right? It's not just for them. I think sevens often think, well, everyone should, just look at the bright side, and everyone should only focus on what's positive, and it's only negative to focus on the negative. I think they can often have pride in that perspective. And of course, as we've mentioned a few other times, sometimes when there's a grain of truth, it feeds pride, right? So I think there is something to the power of positive thinking, to the power of if you can imagine or envision something really positive and line up your feelings with that, that can be a powerful force for good. But of course, they take that way too far, and thinking that that's the only rule of life or that should be the way everybody does it, when sometimes it can be looking at something superficially, or it can be an avoidance or an escape from being with what's true. And again, often life will bring challenges to force you to look at the negative if you insist on avoiding it.
Mm. Yeah, I also think sevens can get caught in pride when they feel too self-confident. You sort of said that too, but more also about not only what they think. It's there is also this thing that sometimes is more unconscious for sevens, sometimes it isn't. Of I don't even need other people to like me because I like myself a lot already, you know.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
think there is lack of pride in that, and
Yeah.
also in believing that they can convince people of everything with their minds, and that they can be very intelligent in linking things of all kinds, and that they always have um, a lot of ideas that are good, and trusting their ideas too much. But another particular way that that sevens lose touch with humility is when they also trust their thoughts as being very intelligent, and sevens many
Yeah.
times are really smart, but
Right.
like they get hooked in their own vision of things, and a little bit like force in a self-absorbed way or self-referencing way. So
Mhm.
some things I said about force I think also apply for sevens. Yeah, and I think there is the general thing about putting the intellect above other things.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Really good, important things. And again, they can have too much confidence in what they believe in, which can actually be rationalizations, like not wanting to be controlled by others. They have a lot of ideas about what's right and how they should do things and how everyone should do things, but they don't see sometimes the reasonable meaning of limitation, or facing things a different way, and they can be blinded to that. And I
Mhm.
think when sevens get more humble, they see a wider perspective, right? They're not only looking at just one piece of the puzzle, which is the good part. They're looking at the whole thing, and life gets richer and more meaningful when they can do that. When they have the humility to see that their way of seeing things is the way they want to see it, motivated by ego intentions often.
Mhm.
Okay, so maybe let's say a few last things about the dominant instinct
Mhm.
before we end. And I mean, I think the most obvious instinct when it comes to pride, as you've named already, is social, because I think social, kind of like two, is that pride is their main passion, as whereas other types have other passions. Even though everyone can learn from working on pride, I think social instinct, social dominance tend to have more pride, because there is something about the social instinct that has to do with I'm playing a role in the survival of myself and others by doing something for the group that can be a bit grandiose, right?
Mhm.
And again, this is the instinct embedded in the personality. It can be like, I'm bringing something more important here. There's a kind of, we sometimes say there's a God complex or a superiority complex connected to the social instinct, a savior complex. Like, it's my job to bring the truth to the people and to guide people and to bring knowledge or support or help of some kind. And so I think socials have more than average pride. And of course, social twos would have the most pride of all, which is why, and again, no better or worse than any other of the other ego problems. But when we're talking about pride and humility, it's the biggest thing for social twos. And I do find in my travels that social twos have the hardest time sometimes being really understanding pride and humility and getting out of pride. But for all the types, the social dominant instinct can bring an extra dose of pride. And I think for self preservation, I guess I would just say there can be extra pride in, you know, I take pride in seeing all the dangers in my ability to manage resources and stay safe and secure, and not seeing the way they overdo it. You know, again, there's something in that that's positive, but everything in the ego gets taken way too far and gets seen in the light of a god complex, and so self-preservation dominants go too far in the things that they specialize in, and seeing it through a kind of tunnel vision that that's the most important thing when really it's just part of the puzzle. And then I think sexual instincts, I'll say all three and then I want to hear from you. And then I think the sexual instinct can have too much pride in what I want, and connecting with this other person is the truth, is what should be. It's destiny. It's, you know, this connection is everything, and that's the truth of it. Or my power and attractiveness makes me someone who deserves to win over the other, or be prominent in somebody else's experience, or come first, or be prioritized, or that connection and the way I see it needs to be manifested in exactly the way I want it. And not recognizing that that's not the whole picture, and that they can have too much of a sense of confidence about what they drive for, what they, you know, m- make happen based on the basis of the sexual instinct.
Yeah, I think I'll do just the reverse order. So start with the last one you said. So for
Yeah.
sexual dominance, I think there is pride in their sense of attractiveness and how much they try to be attractive. They can develop pride and also competition. Being very proud about being the one who will win this fight.
Yes.
uh,
Right.
then self-press, I think there is pride behind the self-sufficiency that they hold as a value, and also a little bit in the that think I know how to maintain things better or to manage things in a more proven way that will lead us to success because of that vision of risks and more. And then socials, yeah, I agree that socials fight against pride more. And I think there is a whole thing to be understood about superiority complex, but also this vision that I need to have status in the social hierarchy. It's sometimes very unconscious for socials, but it's there.
Yeah, and I think sometimes socials can rationalize or unconsciously automatically think like my dominance, my status in the group is good for everyone, right? It's not just good for me and my ego. I'm bringing something that is more important than others in a certain kind of way, and my
And because
status is
and because I take care of everybody, I'm
right.
always there for them. So the healer complex, also, the premature child that started healing mother or father from the womb. You know.
Right, right, right. So that's the end of our podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time for the Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.